In a distant time, in the ancient and prosperous city of Ur of the Chaldeans, lived a man named Abram. He was known for his wisdom, integrity, and deep faith in a single God, something rare in a society that worshipped multiple deities. Abram was married to Sarai, a graceful and devoted woman. Despite all the wealth and possessions they had, there was something missing in their lives. They had no children. At an advanced age, this dream seemed increasingly distant. One night, while gazing at the starry sky, Abram felt something different. The stars shone with unusual intensity, as if whispering an ancient secret. It was then that he heard the voice of God, clear and serene, calling his name, Abram. Surprised and reverent at the same time, he responded, "Here I am, Lord." God then said to him, "Leave your homeland, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name famous, and you will be a blessing to many." Abram was astonished. The idea of leaving everything he knew behind was frightening. Ur was a rich city, with thriving commerce, vibrant culture, and all the comforts anyone could desire. But God's promise was grand. Even without children and being old, God promised that Abram would become the father of a great nation. How would this be possible? Doubts could have taken hold of his heart, but Abram's faith was stronger. He trusted in God's words, even though he could not see the entire path ahead. When he shared the revelation with Sarai, she was also surprised. The idea of leaving their home, friends, and the safety of the city was difficult to accept. However, she trusted Abram and his relationship with God. With courage, they decided to obey the divine call. Abram began to prepare everything for the great journey. He gathered his servants, his herds, and all his possessions. His nephew Lot, seeing his uncle's determination, decided to accompany him on this uncertain adventure. The people in Ur were perplexed. "Where are you going?" they asked. "We do not know for sure," Abram replied. "But we trust that God will guide us." And so, they left behind the grandeur of Ur of the Chaldeans. The busy streets and crowded markets gave way to dusty roads and unknown horizons. Each step was an act of faith. They faced scorching deserts, cold nights, and unfamiliar territories. But in every challenge, Abram felt God's presence guiding his steps. During the journey, God appeared to Abram again, reinforcing his promise, "To your descendants, I will give this land." In response, Abram built altars in various places along the way, as a sign of gratitude and worship. These altars were visible testimonies of his faith and served as reminders of the divine promises. Despite his advanced age and lack of an heir, Abram did not lose hope. Every time he looked at the starry sky, he remembered God's words. He imagined his descendants as numerous as the stars, spread across the earth. Abram's trust was not blind but grounded in God's faithfulness. He understood that the fulfillment of divine promises did not depend on human circumstances, but on God's power and sovereignty. His physical journey reflected a spiritual journey of growth and maturation in faith. The story of God's call to Abram is a powerful reminder that sometimes we are called to leave our comfort zones and trust in a greater plan than we can understand. Abram shows us that obedience and faith can open doors to unimaginable blessings, not only for us but for future generations. Thus, Abram became the patriarch of a great nation, not only by bloodlines but by being an eternal example of faith and trust in God. His story continues to inspire millions of people around the world to listen and respond to the divine call in their own lives. If you are feeling motivated and inspired by this content, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more videos like this. We will bring a series of content with biblical teachings and inspiring stories that motivate us to continue and not give up. Let's continue with the story. After receiving God's call to leave his homeland, Abram gathered his courage and decided to obey. The city of Ur of the Chaldeans, where he lived, was a prosperous center of commerce and culture. The streets were busy, filled with merchants selling fine fabrics, exotic spices, and detailed crafts. The houses were sturdy, made of mud bricks, and there were grand temples dedicated to various gods. Despite the comfort and security Ur offered, Abram felt in his heart that he should leave. He shared his decision with his wife Sarai. "God has called us to a new land," he said, holding her hands. Sarai, although apprehensive, trusted her husband and his faith. "Where will we go?" she asked. Abram responded honestly, "I do not know exactly, but God will guide us." His nephew Lot also decided to accompany them. Lot was young and saw this journey as an opportunity for growth and adventure. Together, they began to prepare everything for the departure. They gathered their servants, who were like family to them, and collected all their possessions: sheep, goats, cattle, and all the necessary utensils for the nomadic life they were about to embrace. News of Abram's departure spread quickly. Neighbors and friends came to bid farewell, some offering gifts for the journey, others questioning his decision. "Why leave all this?" they asked. "You have everything here." Abram replied serenely, "God has bigger plans for us. Although we do not know the way, we trust in His guidance." On the day of departure, the sun rose golden on the horizon, illuminating the path ahead. The caravan began to move slowly, with the animals and servants following in line. Sarai looked back, seeing the city of Ur grow smaller, and felt a mix of nostalgia and expectation. Abram walked ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon, guided by unwavering faith. The journey was not easy. They faced arid deserts, where the heat of the day was scorching and the nights were cold. The roads were uncertain, and they often had to rely on the hospitality of strangers. On some occasions, they faced sandstorms that made it difficult to see a hand's length ahead. But in all these challenges, Abram remained calm and confident. He often withdrew to pray, seeking God's direction. During the trip, God appeared to Abram in visions and dreams, reaffirming His promises. One night, while resting under the vast starry sky, God said to Abram, "Look at the stars. If you can count them, so will your descendants be." Abram looked up at the sky, marveling at the countless bright stars. Those words filled his heart with hope. Even without having children at that time, he believed that God would fulfill His promise. Sarai watched her husband and admired his faith. Although she also desired a child, she found strength in Abram's trust. Lot, in turn, learned from his uncle about faith and perseverance. The stories Abram told about God's promises filled the nights around the campfire with meaning and purpose. At a certain point in the journey, they arrived at a place called Shechem, in the land of Canaan. There, God appeared to Abram again and said, "To your descendants, I will give this land." In gratitude, Abram built an altar at that place, dedicating it to God. It was a way to mark that moment and place as sacred, a testimony of the covenant between him and God. As they moved forward, Abram continued building altars in different places, not only as acts of worship but also as milestones of faith. Each altar was a physical reminder of God's promises and the journey they were undertaking together. The challenges did not cease. There were times of scarcity, such as when they faced severe famine that temporarily led them to Egypt in search of sustenance. Even in these difficult circumstances, Abram sought to act with wisdom and integrity, although he did not always make the best decisions. But God remained faithful, protecting and guiding his family. Along the way, Abram's caravan grew. Not only in terms of material possessions but also in people who joined him, attracted by his leadership and the presence of God in his life. They formed a united community, sharing joys and challenges, always moving forward toward the promise God had made. Abram's faith was a source of inspiration to everyone around him. He taught that trusting in God meant moving forward even when the path was unclear. That true security was not in possessions or familiarity, but in the certainty that God was with them. Finally, after many months of travel, they settled in a place where they could care for the herds and cultivate the land. Although the promise of a great offspring had not yet been realized, Abram knew he was exactly where God wanted him to be. And that was enough. Abram's story shows us that faith is not a linear or easy journey. It is full of ups and downs, certainties and doubts. But it is this faith that sustains us, giving us the courage to leave the known and embrace the unknown, trusting that a greater purpose is at work. Thus, Abram's departure was not just a physical change of place, but a spiritual journey of trust and obedience. A journey that not only changed his life and that of his family, but also had a lasting impact on future generations, fulfilling God's promise to make him a great nation. Abram's journey continued, but a growing unease took root in his heart. Despite all the grand promises God had made to him, there was one question that troubled him. How could he be the father of a great nation if he had no son? His wife, Sarah, was barren, and both were already old. The marks of time were visible on their faces, and the hope of having an heir seemed increasingly distant. One night, Abram left his tent and looked up at the sky. The stars shone brightly, spread out like a luminous cloak over the darkness. With a heavy heart, he spoke to God, "Lord, what will you give me if I continue to be childless? The heir of my possessions will be Eliezer of Damascus, my servant. You have given me wealth and land, but not a descendant." God heard Abram's sincere plea and responded with an even more specific promise. "This man will not be your heir," the Lord said. "A son born to you will be your heir." Then, God took Abram outside the tent and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if you can. So shall your offspring be." Abram was amazed. God's words filled his heart with hope. Still, human logic made him question, "How is this possible? I am old, and Sarah is beyond the age of having children." But he chose to trust God, believing that the impossible could become possible. Some time later, God decided to establish a formal covenant with Abram. He appeared again and said, "I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be blameless. I will make a covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your descendants." Abram prostrated himself with his face to the ground in reverence. God continued, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. You will no longer be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make your descendants very numerous, and I will establish my covenant with you and your descendants forever." The name change was significant. From Abram, meaning exalted father, to Abraham, meaning father of multitudes. It was a reaffirmation of the divine promise and a sign that God was doing something new in his life. God also said, "As for Sarai, your wife, you will no longer call her Sarai, her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Abram could not contain his reaction. He fell with his face to the ground and laughed, thinking, "Can a 100-year-old man have a child? And Sarah, at 90 years old, will she bear a child?" Despite his momentary disbelief, he respectfully expressed his doubt to God. God, knowing Abram's heart, reaffirmed his promise, "Yes, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. With him, I will establish my covenant, which will be an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." To seal this covenant, God established a visible and lasting sign, circumcision. He said to Abram, "Keep my covenant, you and your descendants throughout their generations. This is the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You will be circumcised every male throughout your generations, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and you." Abram understood the seriousness and depth of this commitment. Circumcision would be a physical reminder of the covenant with God, a sign of dedication and obedience. Without hesitation, he gathered all the men of his household, sons, servants, and slaves, and shared what God had commanded. That same day, Abram, his son Ishmael, and all the men of his household were circumcised. This action demonstrated Abram's immediate faith and obedience. He did not delay what God had asked, even though it could be a painful and difficult procedure, especially at his advanced age. His trust in God was greater than any temporary discomfort. Meanwhile, Sarah also struggled with her own doubts. Upon hearing that she would have a son, she laughed to herself and thought, "After I am old and my master is old, will I really have this pleasure?" But God knew her thoughts and asked Abram, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really give birth now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah will have a son." These words deeply touched Sarah's heart. She began to nurture a hope she had long abandoned. God's promise was clear, and although the circumstances seemed insurmountable, she decided to believe. Days passed, and Abram and Sarah's faith was strengthened. They began to prepare for the arrival of the promised son, choosing the name Isaac, which means he laughs, a reminder of both the initial disbelief and the joy that was to come. Abram's story at this moment is a powerful lesson about trusting God even when everything seems impossible. He questioned, yes, but he did not let doubt keep him from obedience. Instead, he used his doubts as an opportunity to deepen his relationship with God. The covenant of circumcision was more than a ritual. It was a commitment of heart and soul, an external sign of internal faith. Abram understood that God's promises came with responsibilities. He was to be blameless and walk in God's presence, influencing his family and future generations to do the same. This stage of Abram's life shows us that it is never too late to dream, believe, and obey. God can perform the impossible in our lives when we are willing to trust Him fully. Abraham and Sarah are eternal examples that faith does not depend on circumstances, but on God's faithfulness. And so, with the covenant established and the promise renewed, Abram and Sarah awaited the fulfillment of God's word, secure in the knowledge that He who promised is faithful to fulfill. Do you feel any resemblance between the moment you are living and the story told? Do you feel you are experiencing something similar? Tell us how you feel. If you need a prayer or help, share a story of overcoming to inspire us and give us strength not to give up. Comment if you want to help someone or need help. Time passed, and Abram and Sarah remained childless. Despite God's promises, Sarah's womb remained empty, and each passing day seemed to make the dream of motherhood more distant. Sarah, now nearly 90 years old, looked at herself and thought, is it still possible? Will God really fulfill what he promised? Unease took hold of her heart. She saw Abram going out every night to gaze at the stars, remembering the promise of a numerous offspring. Although she loved her husband deeply, she felt guilty for not being able to give him a son. Society at that time highly valued motherhood, and infertility was a source of great shame and suffering. Amid these feelings, Sarah had an idea that, to her, could be the solution. She called her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, a strong and healthy young woman who had worked with her for many years. In that culture, it was acceptable for a maidservant to bear children on behalf of her mistress. Thus, the child would be legally considered Sarah's. One night, Sarah approached Abram and said, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Take my maid Hagar. Perhaps through her, I can build a family." Abram listened to Sarah's words attentively. He realized the pain and frustration in her voice. Although he knew God had promised a son through Sarah, he agreed with the plan, perhaps thinking that this was how the promise would be fulfilled. Hagar then became Abram's concubine. It did not take long for her to become pregnant. Upon realizing she was expecting a son, Hagar began to look down on Sarah with contempt. She felt superior because she was giving Abram something Sarah could not. This behavior deeply hurt Sarah, who felt even more humiliated and rejected. Tension within the family increased. Sarah went to Abram and expressed her anguish. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my maid in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Abram, realizing the gravity of the situation, replied, "Your maid is in your hands. Do whatever you think best with her." Feeling authorized, Sarah began to treat Hagar harshly. The young maid, unable to bear the treatment, fled into the desert. Alone and pregnant, Hagar felt abandoned and afraid. But it was at this moment that the angel of the Lord appeared to her near a spring of water on the way to Shur. The angel asked, "Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going?" She replied, "I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarah." Then the angel said, "Return to your mistress and submit to her. I will greatly increase your descendants so that they cannot be counted. You are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." Comforted by the divine message, Hagar named that place, "You are the God who sees me," for she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." She returned to Abram and Sarah's house, ready to comply with what she was commanded. When the time came, Hagar gave birth to a boy, and Abram named him Ishmael, which means God hears. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Although he was not the son promised by God through Sarah, Abram loved Ishmael and considered him his heir. However, Ishmael's presence did not solve the family problems. In fact, it intensified them. Sarah watched the relationship between Abram and Ishmael with mixed feelings. On one hand, there was jealousy and resentment. On the other, a deep pain from not having her own son. Years passed, and the family dynamics remained tense. Ishmael grew strong and healthy, and Hagar maintained a reserved demeanor, but the tension between her and Sarah was palpable. Abram, sensing the strained environment, sought to maintain peace. He split his time between the tribe's responsibilities and attempting to harmonize his family. Once, during a celebration, Sarah watched Ishmael playing and laughing. Something in that moment sparked her indignation. Perhaps it was the fact that Ishmael was Abram's firstborn, taking the place she desired for her own son. She went to Abram and firmly said, "Get rid of that servant and her son, for the son of the servant will not share the inheritance with my son Isaac." These words deeply saddened Abram. Ishmael was his son, and the idea of sending him away was painful. He spent the night in prayer, seeking God's guidance. The Lord said to Abram, "Do not be distressed about the boy and your maid. Listen to everything your wife tells you, because through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. I will also make the son of the maid into a nation because he is your offspring." With a heavy heart, Abram rose early in the morning, took bread and a bowl of water, handed them to Hagar, and sent her away with Ishmael. Mother and son departed into the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water was gone, Hagar, desperate, placed the boy under a bush and walked away, unable to watch him die. She began to cry bitterly. But God heard the boy's cry, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, saying, "What is troubling you, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. She filled the bowl and gave the boy a drink. Ishmael grew up in the desert, became an archer, and lived in the wilderness of Paran. His mother chose an Egyptian wife for him. Thus, even separated from Abram's house, Ishmael was blessed and became the father of a great nation, as God had promised. The story of Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael is a lesson on the consequences of trying to accelerate God's plans through human actions. Sarah's impatience led to deep family conflicts, causing suffering for everyone involved. Abram had to deal with the pain of separating from his son and managing the tensions between the two women he loved. This narrative also shows God's mercy. Even amid human mistakes, he cared for Hagar and Ishmael, ensuring that his promises were fulfilled. God did not abandon Hagar in the desert, just as he did not forget Abram and Sarah. For us, this story serves as a reminder that faith requires patience and trust in God's timing. Attempts to force events can lead to painful results. It is important to wait and believe that God will fulfill his promises at the right time. Thus, amid challenges and conflicts, Abram's family continued their journey, learning valuable lessons about faith, obedience, and the importance of fully trusting in God. Abram was sitting at the entrance of his tent, seeking relief from the heat under the shade of large oak trees. While watching the horizon, he noticed the approach of three men from afar. Their attire was simple, but there was something special about them that caught his attention. Feeling that these visitors were not ordinary, Abram quickly stood up and went to meet them. Bowing in respect, he said, "My lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass by your servant. Let me bring you some water to wash your feet and rest under this tree. I will get something to eat so you can regain your strength before continuing your journey." The men accepted the invitation with a kind smile. Abram, excited, ran to the tent and said to Sarah, "Quickly, get the finest flour, knead it, and bake some tender cakes." Then he ran to the flock, selected a choice calf, and handed it to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. He also brought curds and milk and served everything to the visitors as they settled under the shade of the tree. As they ate, one of the men asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Abram replied, "She is there in the tent." Then the visitor said, "I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Inside the tent, Sarah was listening to the conversation. Upon hearing those words, she could not contain a silent laugh. She thought to herself, "After being old and my lord already old, will I still have this pleasure?" It was hard to believe that, at her advanced age, she could conceive a child. But the Lord, knowing Sarah's thoughts, asked Abram, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really give birth being old as I am?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah, frightened to have been discovered, denied, "I did not laugh." But he insisted, "No, you did laugh." Abram remained silent, but his heart was filled with renewed hope. He recognized that those men were divine messengers, perhaps the Lord himself among them. The reaffirmation of the promise filled him with renewed hope. After the meal, the visitors stood to depart. Abram accompanied them for a short distance. As they walked, the Lord shared with Abram his plans for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, but that is another story. Back at the tent, Abram found Sarah deep in thought. She looked at him and said, "Is it really possible? After so many years, will we have a son?" Abram held her hand and tenderly replied, "Nothing is impossible for God. We must trust in His word." Days passed, and Sarah began to notice changes in her body. An indescribable joy filled her as she realized she was pregnant. She ran to Abram, tears in her eyes, and exclaimed, "It is true. I am expecting a son." Abram embraced her tightly, and together they thanked God for His faithfulness. When the time came, Sarah gave birth to a healthy boy. They named him Isaac, which means laughter, in honor of Sarah's reaction when she heard the promise. She said, "God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." Isaac's arrival brought a new dynamic to the family. Abram and Sarah, already elderly, found renewed energy in caring for their long-awaited son. Isaac was the fulfillment of God's promises, the living proof that he is faithful and keeps his promises, regardless of the circumstances. This story shows us that even when everything seems impossible to human eyes, God can perform the extraordinary. Sarah laughed in disbelief, but God turned her incredulity into joy. Abram maintained his faith, even in the face of difficulties, and was rewarded for his trust. The visit of the angels was not just an isolated event, but a milestone in Abram and Sarah's journey. It was the moment when God's promise became tangible, paving the way for the formation of a great nation through Isaac. For us, this narrative is a powerful reminder to maintain faith and hope, even when challenges seem insurmountable. God has perfect timing for all things, and his promises are true. Nothing is impossible for him. After years of waiting and numerous trials, the long-awaited promise of God finally materialized in the lives of Abram and Sarah. The news of Sarah's pregnancy was like a ray of sunshine after a long storm. Imagine Sarah's emotion, already in her 90th year, realizing she was carrying life in her womb. Something she had desired all her life, but which, to human eyes, seemed impossible. Each day of the pregnancy was a renewed miracle. Abram, at 100 years old, cared for Sarah with special affection. He prepared meals, fetched fresh water, and ensured she rested enough. The household servants watched with admiration and joy at the love and dedication between the two. Abram's tent became a place of hope and expectation. People around were amazed by the news. "How can Sarah, at her age, be expecting a child?" they asked in intrigue. And Abram replied with a serene smile, "Nothing is impossible for God." The couple's faith served as an inspiration to everyone who knew them. During the pregnancy, Sarah felt the baby move in her womb, and each movement was a confirmation of the divine promise. She and Abram spent hours imagining their future son, choosing names, and dreaming of the day they would hold him in their arms. They decided to name him Isaac, which means laughter, in honor of the joy that filled their hearts when they learned they would be parents. Finally, the awaited day arrived. Under a starry sky, on a quiet night, Sarah went into labor. The women of the community came to help her, bringing medicinal herbs and words of encouragement. Abram, though anxious, remained steadfast in prayer, trusting in God's protection. With the first cry of the baby, a wave of emotion swept over everyone. Sarah held Isaac in her arms, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "God has made me laugh," she exclaimed. "And everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." Abram entered the tent and, upon seeing his wife and son, felt indescribable happiness. That little being was the living proof of God's faithfulness. In the days that followed, there were celebrations and festivities. Abram prepared a large feast to celebrate Isaac's birth. Friends, family, and servants gathered to share in the couple's joy. Songs were sung, stories were told, and laughter echoed through the night. Isaac's arrival brought a new dynamic to the family. Abram and Sarah dedicated themselves to caring for their son, teaching him early on about the goodness and greatness of God. Every smile of Isaac, every gesture, was a reminder of the fulfilled promise. This event not only brought immense joy to Abram and Sarah, but also further solidified their faith in God's promises. They learned that even when everything seems impossible, God is faithful and fulfills his word in his perfect timing. The story of Isaac's birth became a testimony to everyone around, showing that hope should never be lost and that miracles happen when we fully trust in God. Thus, Isaac's birth was not just the beginning of a new life, but also the start of a lineage that would impact future generations. Abram truly became the father of many nations, and his story continues to inspire people worldwide to believe in the power of faith and divine faithfulness. Abram's life was filled with trials and promises, but none as profound as what was about to happen. Isaac, his beloved son, the fruit of God's promise and Abram and Sarah's late joy, was growing strong and healthy. He was the pride of his parents, the embodiment of divine promises, and the hope of a great offspring. One night, as the stars shone in the sky, Abram was in silence, contemplating the vastness of the universe and God's faithfulness. It was then that the Lord's voice came to him, "Abram." He promptly replied, "Here I am, Lord." God said, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you." Abram's heart nearly stopped. The command was clear but extremely painful. To sacrifice Isaac, the long-awaited son, God's living promise? 1,000 thoughts must have raced through his mind. How could he reconcile this command with God's promises about his descendants through Isaac? However, Abram was a man of deep faith. Even without understanding why, he decided to obey. At dawn, Abram rose early. With trembling hands, he prepared the donkey, cut the wood for the sacrifice, and called Isaac. 2 servants would also accompany them part of the way. Isaac, unaware of what was to come, was excited to travel with his father. Perhaps he thought it would be another of the many occasions they would build an altar and worship God together. For 3 days, they walked toward Mount Moriah. The silence between father and son was broken only by the sound of their steps and the animals. Abram, carrying the weight of the mission in his heart, prayed silently, seeking strength and understanding. Isaac, noticing the concern on his father's face, respected the silence. When they saw the mountain in the distance, Abram said to the servants, "Stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go over there. After we worship, we will return to you." He carried the wood on Isaac's shoulders and held the fire and the knife in his hands. As they ascended, Isaac broke the silence. "My father." Abram replied, "Yes, my son." Isaac continued, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abram took a deep breath and said firmly, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." These words carried both hope and sadness. Isaac accepted the response, trusting his father and God. Upon reaching the place God had indicated, Abram built an altar with stones, arranged the wood, and with a heavy heart, turned to Isaac. With tears in his eyes, he explained to his son what God had commanded. Isaac, understanding the seriousness of the situation, might have resisted but chose to trust his father and God. Abram bound Isaac and placed him on the altar, over the wood. With a knife in hand, Abram raised his arm, ready to sacrifice his beloved son. His heart was breaking, but his obedience to God was absolute. At the exact moment he was about to strike, a powerful voice echoed from the heavens, "Abram, Abram." He quickly responded, "Here I am." The angel of the Lord said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abram lowered the knife, and indescribable relief filled his being. He released Isaac immediately, and they both embraced, tears of relief and gratitude streaming down their faces. Suddenly, Abram noticed a ram caught by its horns in a nearby bush. He understood that God had indeed provided the sacrifice. He took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of Isaac. Abram named that place, "The Lord will provide," and to this day it is said, "On the Lord's mountain, it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called Abram a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will bless you and greatly increase your descendants as the stars of the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Abram and Isaac descended the mountain together. The experience further strengthened both their faith. Isaac understood the depth of his father's faith and obedience, and Abram proved that God is faithful and provided what was needed at the right time. This story is a powerful testimony about faith, obedience, and divine provision. Abram showed that he fully trusted God, even when the command seemed impossible to fulfill. He believed that somehow, God would fulfill his promises, even if he could not understand how. For us, this narrative challenges us to reflect on the level of our own faith. Are we willing to trust God, even when we do not understand his ways? Abram teaches us that true faith is not only about believing in promises, but also about obeying, even in the most difficult moments. Thus, the sacrifice of Isaac was not only a test of faith for Abram, but also a foreshadowing of God's faithfulness in providing for humanity. The covenant between God and Abram was renewed, and the story of this patriarch's faith continues to inspire generations to fully trust in God's care and provision. Abraham lived a long life filled with profound experiences with God. From the moment he was called to leave his homeland, through the numerous tests of faith, to the birth of his son Isaac, his journey was marked by unwavering trust in the Lord. Now, in the final years of his life, Abraham reflected on all he had lived through and the impact his obedience would have on future generations. As time passed, Abraham saw his children grow and began to notice the first signs of God's promise fulfillment. Isaac, the promised son, became a wise and virtuous young man. Abraham dedicated himself to teaching him about faith, the importance of listening to God's voice, and obeying his commandments. Together, father and son frequently built altars and offered sacrifices of gratitude, strengthening the bond not only between them but also with the Lord. Abraham also had other children with Keturah, his second wife after Sarah's death. He ensured that all received his blessings and were sent on their own paths, but made it clear that God's covenant would continue through Isaac. Before passing away, Abraham took care to ensure Isaac found a suitable wife, sending his trusted servant to seek Rebekah, a woman of great heart and faith, who would be the ideal companion for his son. In his final days, Abraham was respected by everyone around him. His wisdom was sought by leaders of other tribes, and his presence brought peace and stability to the region. Stories of his experiences with God were shared around evening fires, inspiring young and old to trust the Lord in the same way he did. When Abraham finally rested, at 175 years old, he was buried in the cave of Machpelah, alongside his beloved wife Sarah. His departure was felt by many, but his legacy was just beginning to flourish. Isaac, now the patriarch of the family, carried with him his father's teachings and faith. Abraham's descendants began to multiply, spreading across the land. His grandson Jacob, later called Israel, had 12 sons who became the tribes of Israel. God's promise to make Abraham a great nation was being fulfilled before everyone's eyes. But Abraham's legacy was not limited to his biological family. His story of faith and obedience transcended generations and borders. He became known as the Father of Faith, a title reflecting the depth of his trust in God, even when circumstances were challenging. For the Jewish people, Abraham is the ancestor of their nation, the first to establish a covenant with God. His experiences are fundamental in the Torah, serving as the foundation for teachings and traditions that endure to this day. In Christianity, Abraham is seen as an example of unwavering faith. The Apostle Paul wrote about him, highlighting that he was justified by faith even before the law was given, becoming a model for all who believe. Abraham's story inspires Christians to trust God and follow his ways, even when they do not fully understand his plans. For Muslims, Abraham or Ibrahim is also a central figure. He is recognized as a prophet and an example of total submission to God's will. Islamic tradition honors Abraham for his devotion and the role he played in building the Kaaba in Mecca, making him an important figure in the annual pilgrimage of Muslims. Thus, Abraham's legacy transcends cultures, religions, and times. His life demonstrates the power of faith and the impact one person can have when choosing to obey God. The promises made to him continue to be fulfilled through his descendants and the nations that arose from his lineage. Today, millions of people around the world look to Abraham as an example to follow. His story is told in homes, schools, temples, and churches, teaching about trust, obedience, and the importance of following God's voice, even when the path seems uncertain. Abraham's legacy invites us to reflect on our own faith journey. He reminds us that despite difficulties and challenges, trusting God can lead us to accomplish extraordinary things. His life is proof that faith can change destinies, influence generations, and leave a lasting impact on the world. In summary, Abraham was not just a man of his time but a patriarch whose example remains alive. His story inspires people of all ages to believe in the impossible, to obey with a sincere heart, and to leave a legacy that endures for many generations. The story of Abraham is more than an ancient account. It is a timeless journey of faith, obedience, and trust in God. Abraham faced challenges that seemed insurmountable, left behind everything he knew, and followed an uncertain path, guided only by divine promise. His life shows us that even when circumstances are difficult and answers are unclear, faith can lead us to extraordinary achievements. Abraham teaches us that true faith requires action. It is not enough to just believe. We must take concrete steps toward what we believe, even when the path seems unclear. His willingness to obey God, even in the most challenging moments, such as the sacrifice of Isaac, demonstrates an unwavering trust that we can all strive for in our lives. This story invites us to reflect on our own journeys. What challenges are we facing? Are we willing to trust and obey, even when we do not fully understand the plans before us? Abraham reminds us that we are not alone and that by placing our faith in something greater than ourselves, we can find strength and purpose. May we carry Abraham's teachings into our daily lives, cultivating a faith that inspires us to act, overcome obstacles, and leave a positive legacy for future generations. Just like Abraham, we can be examples of perseverance and trust, impacting not only our lives but also those around us. Remember, nothing is impossible for God. When we trust Him and walk in obedience, even the most distant dreams can become reality. May Abraham's story inspire each of us to live with faith, courage, and determination. Thank you for watching this far. And don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to see more content like this and stories of overcoming, motivation, and interest. Until next time.